Hey everyone, welcome to Beyond the Raise podcast, where we get under the hood of founder scaling stories. Will and I are here today with Aakash Kapur, COO of Nossa Data. Welcome to the podcast, Cash.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No problem at all, sir. So what we generally sort of do as a very quick, in one sentence, what is it that Nossa Data does?
In one slightly long sentence, the same way that lots of companies traditionally used to report on financial services and financial data, they're increasingly reporting on non-financial data. We specifically focus on environmental, social, and governance, but there's a wide variety of non-financial data that companies have to report on. We help corporates synthesize that, align it across different reporting requirements, get it ready for regulators, rating agencies, and all the other stakeholders that they need to get it ready for.
Okay, fine. And then, so is that, you just sort of touched on there from a regulatory standpoint, is that quite a big part of what your business and why it exists effectively? Because people needed that.
I wouldn't necessarily say why it exists, just because ESG reporting has been going on for a long time. You have a 20-year timeline of increased requirements that have come from investor expectations and investors wanting to know, okay, is there a higher likelihood that this company has a strike because of the way they're treating their employees? More recently, there has been, increased regulation. There's also been like a push and pull there of, regulation coming to scope and then it getting detracted for various reasons. But there's increased regulatory pressure in the EU, in the UK. There's new standards that have come out from IFRS who have implemented standards that have been getting adopted by a wide variety of different countries. As they get implemented, it increases the amount of regulation that big companies have to adhere to.
Okay. I know were you one of the first to sort of start that? Because as you say, when you hear about this type of thing, it's normally sort of financial markets related. So is it competitive in that space, or have you sort of carved a bit of a niche for yourselves?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I mean, when I joined, I came on as a very early hire, and one thing that attracted me to this business was that it was one of the few that was actually doing the corporate side versus working on specifically just selling to asset managers and investors. I'd say as time's gone on, it's obviously, if you have a good space, if you're working in a good market, there's a good chance that people are going to get attracted. We've seen an increased amount of people getting into our space, but I'd still say it's not overly saturated. There are a lot of people trying to figure out the best approach to it. What are the real things that companies need? So I think we've carved out a pretty decent space for ourselves and do quite well in certain areas. And that's, helped make our case stronger. But yeah, there have been new entrants, other companies that are doing something in an adjacent space, looking more at what we do. But I think there's more than enough business to go around.
Do you find that from a sort of sales perspective, from a commercial standpoint into the market, do people get confused about what it is you offer due to the normality of it being more financial markets, or do people get what it is quite quickly, or do they get it wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of that's up to us, right? So I think sometimes if you're engaging with anyone and everyone who has, the right hashtag or job title, you're not doing your homework all the time. So we're quite precise in terms of what we look at to make sure that we're not just targeting random people and getting the wrong insights, unless we want to learn more about a certain space that's adjacent. I find that it's more confusing to people when I'm going to, a cocktail hour, a networking event, meeting with certain investors. I think that's where it sometimes gets more confusing for people. When it comes to our direct prospects, the corporates we talk to, I think they're quite clear on the value proposition immediately. I think they see exactly what we do, upon a couple of slides or light conversation. But it's when you start getting outside that space, or if you talk to a few consultants who maybe view us as a good partner rather than a direct client relationship, that's where we, have to use a fine comb and maybe explain things a bit more precisely.
You mentioned earlier when you joined the company. So how long have you been with Nossa Data? What's your journey been with them like?
Yeah, I joined 5 years ago now. I think as of a couple of weeks, it'll be exactly 5 years. Yeah, I mean, we've grown a lot. We've seen, a ton of different uh, uh, types of things going on. We've seen increased pressure from investors. We've seen regulatory markets, which have been really kind of confusing for a lot of people. And it's been really nice to actually be a grounded source for a lot of people. A lot of people view us as like an educational resource, and that's something that's grown over time.
Okay. And what does the business look like now versus, I mean, when it was in the early days?
5 years ago. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's the obvious like buzz terms, right? Product market fit, and whether we would have viewed ourselves as being at an MVP stage when I joined. I think some of those somewhat come into scope. I think we've gotten better at, pitching from a perspective of, you know, are we talking to the right person on day one? Are we asking the right questions? Are we getting the right insights from people if there is an immediate alignment? And so I think we were doing a lot more kind of insights building and trying to continuously improve the product, and we were a bit more focused there. And then once we got to a point where people are liking what we're doing, we have some really cool logos, we have impressive case studies on our website and different clients that we're able to talk about. Once we got to that stage, it's like, okay, we can replicate this. And then you start looking at creating more of a replicable model. You look at, okay, what can we do with the resources that we have? Should we maybe be engaging more in these sorts of spaces and really investing a lot more time and money in this sort of space versus before, when we're maybe spreading it out a bit more and trying to figure out, these are the events that maybe could be worth it for us. These are the events, let's check it out. Now we're a lot more focused, and I think have a better idea of what we're doing.
It's easy to kind of say, look, let's cast the net as wide as we can and kind of try to go after everything. But sometimes that can end up being a bit of a distraction, and it takes a bit of time to, I guess, refine that exact product fit or the perfect sort of target client, etc. That sounds like a journey that you've gone on, and then you've sort of refined that in terms of is it the product that's been refined and perhaps potentially even changed, or was it just that you got better at identifying kind of exactly where it would fit in the market and who you want to sell it to ultimately?
Probably more of the latter. I don't know if better is the right word. It's just that there were a lot of things we learned very early on. I think what we did a good job at is very early on got a lot of insights from a lot of different people in the space, people who are focused on a wide variety of different problems in the space that we were talking to, had their own kind of views, and we were able to see what was aligning and what was similar across the board for different companies. So I think we were just doing well with that. And once we got a bunch of those insights, then it's just a matter of what can we implement, what's practical to implement, what makes sense to implement, what is actually being done by the same users. So, if we're building a ton of other things that have the hashtag ESG attached to it, but they're not necessarily really in the realm of the person that we're talking to or who's using our product on a daily basis, then maybe that's something that we focus on for another time. So I think it was really just about, putting that feedback together and thinking, okay, what is the best thing to be adding to our product? What makes more sense for us commercially? What makes sense even for our clients? Some of our clients who came on early on were looking to have a product that's continuously improving. So we wanted to make sure that they felt that benefit, that they trusted us early, that, their feature requests were getting put into the platform more regularly. So it really was just a prioritization once we figured out that we are getting good feedback, just figuring out what we should put into the system next.
Was there a point where, something nearly sort of slowed or killed the business? Is that something that you were aware of? If so, what was that, and sort of how did you address it?
Yeah, I don't know that we had something that necessarily could have killed the business. I think there are just a lot of worrying things, right? My background, to give it a bit of a parallel, was more in traditional finance. My immediate role directly before joining Nossa was at an AI unicorn, which was the opposite kind of funding, if you can imagine. I think when you're like constantly thinking about what you were just in and what you're in now, it can be a bit scary at times. Even now, I think there's smaller numbers that excite me versus working in asset management. I think if you were talking about getting 100K in revenue from someone, when I was working in asset management, that would have not excited anyone. That wouldn't have been something to really celebrate. So you're looking at different numbers, you're looking at different things entirely, you're looking at a completely different scope of metrics. So I don't know that I have a funny story or anything like that, but there's just a lot of moments where you're thinking, okay, like is the business, as safe as you might think it is. There are moments where we decided maybe to not go for more fundraising, for example, and decided to go the route of an Innovate UK grant, which we successfully got, and that helped us postpone some fundraising. There are a lot of moments, where you can't help but think, what if that was different? What was that was different? 5 years on, thankfully, nothing like too disastrous has happened.
Have you tried to sort of do any government grant funding of recent? Just I've heard that the environment in that regard is completely different now, and actually really challenging. Like where government are deploying capital is now completely not necessarily different, but I think it's laser focused. And I think before maybe it was a bit more open. I don't know if you've got any experience of that now compared to what you were before, or if you're still doing that type of stuff. Or...
Yeah, it's a thing I definitely have to have my eye on. So I think it was very focused before, to be honest. I think they had a pretty good system actually in terms of their application process. There were a lot of grant writers that were flooding the space though, and there were other things I think that were maybe impacting things. I remember meeting someone who told me that I think they spent 11K and 11% of the winnings on a grant writer, and the grant writer, you're actually not allowed to write into the project. So you know that someone has to have a ton of money before that to be able to really get that project over the line. They've changed a lot. They've paused the Smart Grant, and I know that they've put a few different entrepreneurs in charge now, and Innovate UK is going to kind of completely revamp how it does its funding. They have a new initiative that they've taken on where you can partner with an investor who's approved on their list, and that can be part of the funding that you get from them, and then part of it comes from Innovate UK. So yeah, I'm less well versed, but I mean it's definitely gotten a bit confusing because I think it's less of an application process, and they're now looking at like who's the founder and what's their background, which maybe is more aligned to how a VC would invest. But then there's the question of, was the whole point to not be a VC? But curious, I don't honestly, Alex, like what are you hearing?
Yeah, I think I think that point there you just raised, I think that's quite an interesting point, because it does feel like it's shifted more towards a VC panel approach to it rather than a grant. It shouldn't be called a grant if it's going to sort of have that tag to it. I think the guys and girls that we've been talking to recently have just found where government want to deploy their capital seems pretty stringent. And unless you are sort of within that sweet spot, I think it seems they're finding it quite difficult. Interesting you say it's sort of maybe always been a bit like that. I think they certainly seem to have found it easier to, get those grants maybe 3-4 years ago compared to now. So I mean, I think raising money in any way at the moment is challenging. I think what we're seeing is software development and defense. Yeah, like money being put there is pretty popular. If you're on the hardware side, that can be really challenging for you at the moment. Yeah.
Have you found that the difference in available capital has forced, it almost sounds contradictory, but a lot of the founders we speak to sometimes find that through having less, they've had to be more deliberate and more resourceful and more innovative with what they have. Has that ended up being a sort of silver lining or a positive in any way? More from going from an environment where you were
Just
in
to clarify,
AI
do you mean in
and you were
terms of
getting
like VCs
sounded like you were
offering less
alluding to
because
having
they expect you to be more efficient?
available capital. We've spoken to founders previously where they've been in environments where there's almost limited, endless R&D budget or endless budgets to go towards things, versus then now in a kind of bootstrapped environment. Not putting words in your mouth, but if that is the contrast that you've experienced, if so, has that been unexpectedly beneficial in any way?
I mean, I think the benefit is if you're looking at it comparatively, we've always been that kind of hunkered down model. I mean, we did a 1.2 million round several years ago, and we've been going off of that and got the cash flow positivity. So I think for us, we've just been able to kind of operate efficiently without needing to really push that, we're doing AI and getting more funding. So I think, we've kind of been skilled in that already and maybe had to learn how to operate that way. Generally, I think people are getting more efficient. I think that's partially a good thing. I think outside of the realm of building the product, even on commercial teams and things, there's a lot more AI being used. There's a lot more tools you can use out there to synthesize what you're doing in terms of those processes and really save you time.
We've talked before about some of the ridiculous valuations that you've seen in previous years. It doesn't feel the market's there now anymore. And there's positives in that as well. I think it doesn't make for so much of a headline reading, but actually then the reality on the ground is often beneficial when people look back on it. It doesn't necessarily always feel like that at the time. It'd be nice to have.
Yeah, I mean, even if you're looking at forget Nossa data for a second. If you're just looking at the market, I think you want things to have some level of truth in economic reality and unit economics. You don't want something that is purely fueling, something that's going to be a bubble in 3 or 4 years. So I think some of that is a good thing. I think there was some overfunding in some spaces. I call it hashtag fundraising. There are certain things where you can attach yourself onto a bandwagon and you're setting yourself either something out magnificent or you're going to see a bubble that probably destroys more value than it creates.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, back in a previous business, honestly, I remember multiple examples of, cool idea for sure, but, never run a business before as a founder. And they were getting multi-million-dollar valuations. And it was obviously great, exciting for them. But when you understood it and you looked at the nuts and bolts of it, it's this person's never run a business and was leaning on us to sort of say, when do I hire that type of person? And when, because it was literally just an idea. And you think, I don't think it makes sense. for that funding to have happened, and it just bloated the market, and it got a little bit silly. So I don't think it's a bad thing that that's not happening anymore, but maybe it's gone too far the other way. But as you say, these things are cyclical. Okay, so then moving into sort of a bit of like, hiring, team inflection points, that type of thing. So, was there a hire that you guys made that truly changed the trajectory of the company? Or, you and the other execs were sort of looking at each other thinking, why on earth didn't we hire this person earlier? But did you have any of those sort of moments?
I think that happens all the time. I think one thing we've really benefited from is we've not had a ton of employee churn. I think we've had some really good hires in the company who've stayed really long term. I'm not a super unique case in the business as someone who stayed. So I think it's hard to pick out one person and say, that person really did everything. But we've been fortunate, I think, in our hires. We've generally hired well on the commercial side, on the engineering side. Everyone really is up for the task, is up for the industry. Everyone's motivated for what we're doing. I think we just made a good split, I think, and we're sometimes slow to hire. It was slow to kind of decide to maybe get someone on board who might resolve something. So yeah, you might get that feeling of, oh, we should have done this sooner or something like that. But I think at the end of the day, we've taken our time and we've usually made like quite good hires for the most part.
Yeah. And do you think your process to hiring is very strong in terms of filtering out the people that aren't right culturally, technically, etc.? And it might be both, by the way. So please feel free to gloat a little bit. Or is it just the culture is, it's a cool place to work. Everyone's relaxed, it's chill, but work hard, play hard. I hate that saying, but it's true. So how have you achieved that sort of tenure in so many people across the business, do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I think the low employee churn does help. So in terms of the cultural bit internally, it's the same culture. I've been in other environments that feel more erratic where you have 2 or 3 senior leaders leave at once and it's just a shock to the culture, right? Like that's the person you used to talk to every day or used to manage that team is completely gone. So I think that's been a benefit to us. We are big on interviewing for culture. So I'd say a big chunk of both the screen round at the very beginning as well as the final round, which we literally call the cultural round, is hugely important. I think we've benefited from the fact that we do ESG and a lot of people want to work in that space. A lot of people want to take their skills into sustainability. So we have a bit more of a top of the funnel in talent sometimes when we bring these people in. But then when we do that final round, we ask things, even to a software engineer, we'll ask, what's your favorite ES or G topic? Or tell me something that you're really down with in terms of its impact on the environment, or, do you really care about governance? We'll ask those sorts of questions as if it's, we're hiring someone for a speaking engagement because we really want everyone to have some level of affinity with what we're doing. And that has been a way to suss people out as well, because some people have, come across really well in every other round and every other conversation, very heavily skilled, but you don't want to get somebody just going to leave in 3 months as well for something else that looks a bit more shiny. So I think we just take it really, really seriously. And then internally, I think people do enjoy working with each other as well.
Yeah. No, I think when you're in that mission-driven space, it is a different type of person compared to maybe financial services. Not that I'm saying financial services can't be mission-driven, but let's face it, it's a bit different. I appreciate what you're saying about, we took our time perhaps with that hire, but were there any hires that you just simply pulled the trigger on too late? You should have had that person in situ way, way before you actually did, not because of the time frame, because you just pulled the trigger on it too late.
I think one thing it makes it hard to say, I'm not sure who the other, startups are that you're talking to, but we're still 11 people. So I think for us, it's tough to say, oh, we should have gotten the 9th person more quickly. Like, I think we've been quite resource efficient. We raised a 1.2 million round a few years ago, and we're still operating on that. We got to cash flow positive without having to, heavily worry about too much. So I think, I wouldn't say anyone was too late, but we feel the resources when you're this small, getting an extra person in any direction, like you feel it. There's a huge difference in what you're able to get accomplished. So yeah, I mean, could we have maybe done a few things sooner? Sure, but we did a round and then we hired a few people and then we continuously grew and hired a few more people. So I think we've been quite steady, and I wouldn't have that reaction or that regret of this person should have come on sooner, because it's part of the whole ethos of what we've done is growing sustainably and making sure that we also don't have to do, drastic changes all the time.
Yeah. No, I think that's, it sounds like you've done it in a smart way. I think we quite often find with founders that we're talking to is that they're just a bit guilty of being a bit, well, no, I can probably take that on. I can probably do that. I'm not working Saturday and Sundays at the moment, so I'll do it then, or, whatever it is. So I think it's really important and good for many reasons, for the business, for mental health, burnout, etc., that you've identified that rather than saying, no, I can take more onto my plate, which is what we sort of see an awful lot in the conversations that we're having.
Yeah, I mean, it still could be happening. I think it's we're constantly having to prioritize what we choose to do. I think until you're really a massive, massive company, and even then, it sounds like people are quite restricted in what they have in free time. It does seem like, you have to constantly make a decision of this is the thing I'm going to prioritize today. And then it's a question of, okay, at that point, should that actually fall off and not happen until next week? Or should that be the thing that we get someone in to do? So it's constantly a balancing act. I just probably haven't had that emotional reaction that you're talking about. Oh, I should have done this much sooner.
Yeah. No, good. That's a good thing. And then were there any sort of great hires? It sounds like you've done a very strategic, pragmatic, sensible approach to this, which is great. But were there any hires that you made that on paper you thought this is a bit risky because, i.e., we're small, they're expensive, but they've been doing what we do for a very long time, and it's the right sales guy, as an example, or just risky in other ways and maybe taking the business in a different direction that you weren't, fully embedded in and weren't quite sure. Was there any sort of turned out great, but actually on paper it was a little bit risky?
I don't know that it looked risky, but there are certain people who've just done like very, very well, and we didn't get them from a senior capacity. So, I mean, we have like an ESG integration team that's, we were able to get people quite early in their careers, and I think they've all done phenomenally well. I think some other companies might look at that as, oh, this person's risky. Like, can we really trust that person to do it? I don't think we really ever had that feeling. I was also quite confident in, whether it's myself coming on or the founder's already there. The CEO founder already knew a lot about ESG. I knew a lot about ESG from my background, so I was quite confident that we could create that environment with junior people. But I think that, that's an example of a team that's done phenomenally well and has kind of grown their careers at Nossa Data without having to have a background at BlackRock, Salesforce, or whatever it is that makes that CV look more impressive and less risky.
Totally. Yeah, it makes sense. And then what about, I don't like terming it bad hires, but let's say, have there been hires that maybe haven't worked out? And if so, what was the impact on the business, either, emotionally, but also commercially?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough. If like you have a hire that doesn't work out on the sales side, sometimes it's not necessarily the case that it's like a bad salesperson or a bad set of skills somewhere. Sometimes things just like didn't align and didn't work out. And I think that can happen. And I would always just recommend to people to try and find the alignment almost more than the skill, because sometimes you find like someone's really good at what they do. That alignment is almost more important. There are some people out there who, they could never sell a refrigerator, but could sell microwaves all the time. It's just there's those pieces of alignment that you really need to get figured out. And I think that's probably where I'd focus. And in terms of the impact on the commercial team, I think one thing that a lot of people miss out on is how much management you have to put in sometimes to, actual time in terms of managing someone and training them and getting people up to speed, making sure as well that they're happy and that their career is looking good and that they're excited to be part of the team. And I think I definitely have some friends in the space who've not put in effort in that. And then you fail because they never really got on board and because they didn't get up to speed. And then there's, the side of, okay, if you overinvest though in time and then it still doesn't work out, then it's obviously going to impact commercially because you as a sales leader could have been doing more sales yourself. You could have been doing more commercial activity.
Yeah.
So it's just, you have to make sure that alignment's really there.
Yeah, 100%. So important, especially when you're small, because the impact is huge otherwise.
I mean, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that. Obviously, you're heavy into recruiting. What's your perspective on all of that?
On the bad hire side?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, right? So what we tend to see and find is when a founder starts a business in a space that they know, we generally tend to find that those people are slow off the mark to scale and hire people in the right places. And then when they do, it's like, oh my God, this is amazing. Why didn't I do this earlier? Because they are guilty of saying, well, I do know it. I can do it. I'll take that on. But when we have founders that maybe they are technically very strong, I don't know, ex-Google as an example, but they maybe don't know that space inside out, they just think there's a problem to solve, they are generally much quicker off the mark because they have to be. Because it's like, well, I don't know. I can't do it. I wish I could, but I can't. So I need to hire the people around me to do it. And we find those businesses definitely get off that mark much, much quicker and sort of feel like a proper business scale up rather than a startup way earlier, whereas the others feel a bit more embryonic for a lot longer because of that nature of what I've just said. And look, that comes from a good place. You know, I've been that person as well, where I'm like, no, you don't need to hire that person. I and my team can definitely do that for now. It's fine. It won't be brilliant. It won't be perfect, but it'll certainly be good enough. I'm not saying that I think that actually was the right decision for us in that business at that time, actually. I genuinely do. But then all of a sudden you get to that point, you think we're a bit stuck here. We need this hire, and then you start the process, and then they're on a 3-month notice period, and actually it's more like 6 or 7 or 8 months from that point of going, we really need this person now. So yeah, I think it's always an interesting one. And I think on the bad hire front, like I said, I don't like calling them bad hires. There's two sides to that coin. And I think maybe what we see quite often is that people think they're going to like the startup, but they've not done it before and they don't actually get what that means. It is roll your sleeves up, crack on with anything and everything, be the person and help one another out. And if you're used to being in a bigger firm with teams that support those teams, and there's very siloed process, all of a sudden, if you're not just doing that, inch wide, mile deep part of a vertical, you're doing every aspect of it. That's a very different gig, which you either do or don't like. And I would say in the last business that I was heavily involved in, when we moved from, I would probably say 150 people, when we did the big jump up to sort of more like 400, people didn't enjoy that scale up part of the journey. They liked it being more nimble, less process, less red tape. They loved the fact there wasn't an expenses policy, but at 400 people, we had to have an expenses policy. But that for us was really interesting that, they didn't enjoy that scale up piece. And there was a lot of people and senior people as well, not just like grads who like, oh, I love the cool startup vibe. It was when we went through that scale up piece, a lot of them were just like, I don't think this is for me. I preferred it before. So you get it both ways.
Yeah, I think I've seen that more at other companies and like other friends I've talked to in the space. And I think that's usually a funnel problem because sometimes there is a shiny brand, you might see a Google or something. And a lot of those people are highly, highly skilled and very intelligent. So I'm not trying to take that away from it. But sometimes you do realize that people look at those logos a bit too much and they actually were just a part of one vertical and, just had, not necessarily limited responsibility, but were very hyper-focused in their responsibilities and don't necessarily know how to broaden that. But then you find that there's a funnel sometimes for people who go from those roles into VC, into high-growth startup, and they just actually haven't had that sort of worry of, you need to figure out expenses, even though it's not part of your job. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a funnel problem as well.
Yeah, and we used to have, look, with the expenses, if you think you're taking the piss, you probably are. And that worked so well. It was brilliant. But then, we had a different CFO code. It was like, no, I think we actually have to have a figure related to the relevant activity and it's 35 quid a head or whatever it is. And that's what people didn't like. Because if you feel like you're taking the piss, you probably are, was working so well.
What part of selling into this market is maybe harder now looking back than you expected it to be? I think often people have that reflection. Yeah, open question, but it'd be really interesting to understand from a commercial lens for you guys.
Yeah, I think maybe some of this was coming from my experience working in the States, but I was just used to a bit more of a clarity on budget. And I think sometimes you see these numbers that fly around and it's PwC and EY did this $1 million deal with this company. And you realize the area that you're in and you think, okay, well, we can probably grab some of that. We do that much more efficiently. We do that much more tactfully, are loved by all of our clients. What's the problem? But then you realize these kinds of other levers that are in place and who's got the relationship with the right people and the right decision makers, even outside of your direct realm. And, you kind of have to be a bit more proactive on what is the actual route we're going. And usually startups have to go the route of, finding a champion. So you find a champion, they sell for you internally, they're the ones who get your budget, and then you have to like really arm them. But I think what's really kind of tough to figure out is there is this other step of people who just manage to go over all of that, and they are able to sell directly into a company irrespective of the champions at play, irrespective of the right users being involved. And I think that's the area probably where in the space there's a bit less clarity. How does a massive consultant get this partnership in this space versus these startups that are selling for much less, much more efficiently? Again, they're loved by the teams that are using them. How do you create that kind of especially when you're a young company?
And in terms of, and I'm interested in this question because I've definitely been guilty of it. And do you know what? Probably still can be at times. Have you, or did you sort of come across certain type of customer that actually turned out to be a distraction in terms of you were going at a part of the market, you were getting some traction, and you sort of went deeper into that, but actually it turned out that it really wasn't ever going to sort of materialize to anything you needed? Yeah, that type of thing. Did that sort of happen at the start or even now?
Yeah, I think as well, just from my background in investment management, sales was done very differently there. You're you're just much more accepting and kind of willing to acknowledge long sales cycles versus when you're in tech and in the space that we're now at Nossa. And with that, you kind of have this ability to hold on to a deal and call something a deal in the pipeline or an opportunity in the pipeline for several months without really having a ton of engagement, without really knowing what's happening, without knowing when they're releasing their RFP. So I think early on, I maybe had a bit more of that perspective coming from investment management of, oh, well, this was a strong lead. They really liked our product. Whereas I think what you really have to hone in on in the tech space is understanding timing in that sales cycle and making sure that's really, really compact. So now, I'll still talk to anyone, even if someone's not interested in buying right now. I'll still be happy to get insights, see what we can do to build and more benefit the product. But I won't necessarily keep trying to push that as a sale. I'll be like, okay, that's great. We'll touch base in 6 months or something if that's needed. And you still did that stuff in investment management, but I think you had a bit more of an expectation of still treating that as if it's part of your sales cycle. Now I won't really consider that part of the sales cycle. That's just kind of how you generate contact, how you generate leads. But I think, now we're just a bit more tight in terms of what we consider a possible opportunity. We don't stretch things out too long. We're happy to go to losses quicker as well. It doesn't matter as long as we know why something was lost, we're happy to kind of just figure that out and re-engage them the next time.
Yeah.
We don't hang on to things nearly as much as we used to.
No, I think, it's just when you're sort of first starting out, it just someone says yes, it's so tempting to just investigate that, but it can end up being a distraction for sure.
Klaus, is there anything you'd do differently if you could do it all again now, looking back?
I mean, specifically within sales, I think early on I maybe leaned a bit too much. This is probably a personal thing more so than this data. I leaned a bit more on my experience in investment management, which I think was hugely helpful, but it is just a different space. So I think the tactics are slightly different. I mean, you would never do mass campaigns to thousands of people, for example, in investment management. I think there's all kinds of licensing issues, and especially in the States with SEC licensing and your series license. Where's that email actually coming from? What domain? Things like that. So I think there were just quite a few areas that I was less exposed to. Once learning about it, but more than willing to get my hands dirty and figure that out. But I think some of those were maybe just not there in my repertoire when I joined.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And then just moving a little bit more about, from that sort of, exec lens, if you like, was there a belief you had about startups that now you've sort of gone through that journey, and obviously you guys are, still a sort of, on the smaller side, but, certainly scaling, that is completely different. You thought, okay, that's what a startup is. And now you've lived it. You go, actually, I was wrong. It's not like that at all. Or there's a belief you had that isn't correct.
I don't know if it's a belief. I definitely think that I had a different impression of what, a good startup was, quote unquote. We just talked about some companies that got overfunded. Some of those, maybe I looked at the flashy headlines before and thought, oh, those are, doing really well. Those are great startups. But really now I think what I've changed in is how I itemize skills. That now I'll look at that and I won't say that's bad. I won't say that they overfunded. I'll never kind of immediately jump to that. But I'll say, wow, they are really good at fundraising.
Yeah.
They're really good at figuring that bit out.
Yeah.
They've nailed that down. They maybe don't have the product yet, but they figured that out. Um, and that's kind of how I just really compartmentalize these things as well. Or then you'll find a company that decided to, the companies that decided to seed strap or abandon their tech and just go straight consulting because things weren't working out. And then they scaled a lot more. And you're like, oh, they're actually really good at sales. They couldn't figure
Yeah.
out the product. So they couldn't build something, but they managed to get to multi-millions in revenue because they were able to sell once they decided, right, let's not try and sell a product. Let's just try and sell ourselves. So I think that like itemization of things and really realizing that people who do well are doing well in all of those things. But I no longer just look at, a single headline and say, oh, that was, that's a quote unquote good startup. Whereas before, I think that was my approach.
Yeah. No, okay, makes sense. And then what about advice to a founder, exec in the sort of, in a startup that's 12 months behind you? Is there anything, and you may maybe go back to the earlier days where the learning was really, really up. Was there anything if someone was 12 months behind you, you would sort of say to them, look, this is something I learned, which I think would be helpful?
Ironically, I'd almost point them to not listen to broad-based startup advice. I think a lot of
Interesting.
what we've done well in is staying close to our knowledge in the domain, knowledge of ESG, knowledge of sustainability, knowledge of what investors care about in ESG, knowledge about what the regulatory space is doing, keeping up to date with all of that. I think that sort of knowledge has been hugely more helpful than, what startups typically say is good, because people are dealing with a completely different risk matrix than you, right? So you could be talking to a startup that has gotten 10 million in funding. You could have a startup that's gotten 1.2 million funding. You could have one that's gotten that fundraising super easily. You could have one where when they were 4 employees, the founder was just fundraising and doing nothing else because it didn't come very easily. So I think really understanding your domain and your exact risk matrix is really probably more important. And, figuring out what your market is doing, figuring out when you're building something, how much can you attribute in expanded market sizing specifically because of what you've just built. And you would know that from your domain expertise, not from broad startup knowledge. So I'd say, yeah, really focus on the domain that you're in is what I'd do.
Yeah, yeah. What about any learnings? Are there any sort of, eureka moments for you in the journey you've had at the start, even, more relatable to now, that you think, okay, that was something that, you don't know what you don't know, right? And just sometimes you just have those experiences. You go, that would have been helpful to know that before.
I mean, obviously, that, like I mentioned, the big consultants who are selling some of those packages, I think, was something to have an eye on. I think generally partnerships, are hugely important to really understand. So, as soon as you have 1 or 2 partnerships, you kind of realize how beneficial they can be, but then you can also waste your time. I guess going back to your other question about wasting time, I think we wasted a lot of time trying to build partnerships. So I think, yeah, just, there are a lot of individual moments. I wouldn't call one of them eureka, but there's just a lot of individual moments where you make massive decisions on the fly to engage or not engage in something. And I wish I could get the time back on each of those to properly assess them. But yeah, I think it was just really just getting focused now on kind of talking to the right companies has benefited us. Whereas before we were constantly just having too many learnings almost. Like, we were meeting with people all the time, trying to set up a partnership, trying to set up a group, a consulting project. And a lot of these things haven't worked out in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. As again, it goes back to what we were saying about the customer, and people, there's interest. You think, okay, we could maybe make something work, but you go down that journey and realize maybe it's a bit of a waste of time. Okay, cool. So, you're sort of quite small, as you sort of said. You're, a nimble, lean machine at 11, which sounds great. What about the next 12 to 18 months? Do you think, and that could be just because of where the business is going, there's going to be a requirement for you to look at either a function or a person to sort of drive things forward?
I would say not right now. I think right now we're happy with the space we're in. If we grow at a certain trajectory, obviously we'd ask ourselves the question. I think one thing we've been doing more recently is actually looking to invest more in resources and not necessarily just hire for any reason. So an example is I'm going to Climate Week Boston in a couple of weeks. Last year I went to Climate Week New York. These are hugely valuable things, not just commercially, but for our overall learning of what's going on in the space and being in those ecosystems. And those are things we didn't spend on at all.
Right.
We weren't spending anything there. We were trying to keep as lean as possible in terms of our commercial spend on travel and things like that. So I think that's where we're actually looking to arm things a bit more is, okay, we know a lot from being in the space. We've managed to, without going to all of these events, like be quite well known in the ecosystem. I'm going to Climate Week in New York last year, and if I go to an ESG event, people know who Nossa Data is, and so I find that like that's quite cool. We managed to get that to that stage, but that also probably means that we should be in this room because they're talking to all the other people that we want to be talking to. So I think in terms of resource management and cash injection, that's the direction we're going in right now.
Yeah.
In 6 months' time, maybe we could kind of change that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's really interesting. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Really good to talk to you, and thanks for your time again. All right.
All right. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Great to chat. Bye.
Bye.